The professor said my analysis of the novel was completely wrong. I wrote the book. I was sitting in the back row of Professor Whitmore's contemporary literature seminar at Riverside University, trying to stay invisible. The classroom smelled like old coffee, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, while 20 students flipped through copies of The Drowning Season, my novel that had won the National Book Award 3 years ago. I'd enrolled in this graduate program under my legal first and middle name, Diana Ashford, instead of my pen name D.A. Mitchell. Nobody had connected the dots yet. I needed this. After the book tour madness and the constant public dissection of my work, I just wanted to be a student again, to hear what people really thought when they didn't know I was listening. Professor Whitmore was considered one of the leading experts on contemporary American fiction, and I was genuinely curious about his interpretation of my work. That curiosity was about to cost me everything. Professor Whitmore stood at the front of the class, holding up his marked copy of my book like it was evidence in a trial. What Mitchell fails to understand about her own protagonist is that Eleanor's drowning obsession isn't about trauma, it's about feminine hysteria. He said this with such confidence, such absolute certainty, that several students nodded and started taking notes. My pen froze on my notebook. I'd spent 2 years writing Eleanor's character, basing her fear of water on my own near-drowning experience at age 12. Every single scene was deliberately crafted to show how trauma reshapes your relationship with the world. Whitmore continued, pacing now, getting into his rhythm. The author clearly intended this as a metaphor for female weakness, the inability to overcome irrational fears. It's almost Freudian in its simplicity. A girl in the front row raised her hand and suggested that maybe the water symbolized Eleanor's attempt to reclaim her power. Whitmore laughed, actually laughed, and said, "That's a very undergraduate reading, Melissa. We're past surface-level interpretations here." I raised my hand slowly, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Whitmore glanced at me with mild interest, probably wondering why the quiet student in the back was suddenly participating. "Yes, Diana?" I cleared my throat and kept my voice steady. "What if the drowning obsession is actually about PTSD? The text specifically mentions Eleanor's childhood incident in Chapter 4, and throughout the book, her reactions align with trauma responses rather than hysteria." Whitmore's expression shifted from interest to condescension in about 2 seconds. He set the book down on his desk and crossed his arms. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you're conflating the character's backstory with the author's thematic intent. Mitchell herself has said in interviews that the book is about the human condition, not some personal trauma diary." He was quoting an interview I'd given to a magazine that had completely twisted my words. I'd actually said the book explores how personal trauma is part of the human condition, but they'd edited it to sound more pretentious and vague. But what if the interview was misrepresented? I pushed back, trying to keep my tone academic and neutral. If you look at the structure of the narrative, every water scene is triggered by specific sensory details that mirror trauma flashbacks. That's not hysteria, that's clinically accurate PTSD representation. Whitmore actually rolled his eyes. He walked closer to my desk, and I could see other students shifting uncomfortably. "Diana, I've been teaching this novel for 2 years. I've published 3 papers on Mitchell's work. I've interviewed her twice for academic journals. I think I understand her intentions better than a first-semester graduate student who's reading the book for the first time." The classroom went dead silent. My face felt hot, and I knew I should just drop it, but something in me snapped. "What if you're wrong about what the author intended?" Whitmore's jaw tightened. "I'm not wrong. Mitchell is a talented writer, but like many young female authors, she doesn't fully grasp the literary traditions she's working within. That's not an insult, it's an observation. The text speaks for itself, regardless of what the author thinks she meant." The girl next to me, Priya, leaned over and whispered, "Just let it go. He's like this with everyone." But I couldn't let it go. This man was teaching my book wrong, was telling students that my carefully crafted representation of trauma was actually about female weakness and hysteria. He was literally using my work to reinforce the exact stereotypes I'd been fighting against. Whitmore moved back to the front of the class and pulled up a slide on the projector. "Let's look at Chapter 12, where Eleanor refuses to get in the boat." Mitchell writes this scene with such melodrama, such excessive emotional reaction, that it borders on parody. A stronger writer would have shown restraint, would have trusted the reader to understand the symbolism without all this hand-wringing. He read a passage aloud in a mocking tone that made my chest tight with anger. That chapter had taken me 6 months to write. I'd rewritten it 43 times trying to capture the exact feeling of panic, the way your body refuses to cooperate when you're triggered, the shame of knowing you're being irrational but being unable to stop it. After class, I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, hands shaking on the steering wheel. I pulled out my phone and called my agent, Beth, who answered on the second ring. "Diana, how's the graduate school experience?" Her voice was bright and warm, completely unaware of the storm I was about to unleash. I told her everything, my words tumbling over each other, about Whitmore's interpretation and his condescension and how he was teaching my book as an example of female hysteria. Beth was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Diana, honey, this is why I told you going back to school under a different name was a bad idea. You can't control how people interpret your work even when they're wrong." I knew she was right, but it didn't make it hurt less. She suggested I either reveal my identity or transfer to a different class, but both options felt like giving up. I'd paid for this semester, I'd earned my place in this program, and I wasn't going to let Whitmore's ego drive me out. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my original manuscript notes spread out in front of me. I'd kept everything from the writing process, character sketches, research on trauma responses, interviews with therapists, pages and pages of my own journal entries about my near-drowning experience. I photographed each page systematically, building a file of evidence proving Whitmore's interpretation was objectively wrong. My cat, Gatsby, jumped on the table and knocked over my coffee mug, sending brown liquid spreading across my notes. I grabbed paper towels and started blotting frantically. watching the ink blur on pages I'd written 5 years ago. Some of the damage was irreversible, but I'd already taken the photos. I uploaded everything to a secure cloud folder and labeled it Drowning Season, Author's Intent Documentation. Then I opened my laptop and started drafting an email to the department chair explaining the situation. I wrote and deleted it 4 times before closing my laptop in frustration. How do you prove you're the author without sounding insane or attention-seeking? The next class session, Whitmore announced we'd be doing group presentations on different chapters of the book. He assigned me to chapter 18, the climactic scene where Eleanor finally confronts her fear. My group consisted of 3 other students: Priya, a guy named Austin who never spoke, and Kayla, who treated every class like a TED Talk audition. We met in the library that afternoon to divide up the work, sitting at a table surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Kayla immediately took charge, announcing she'd handle the introduction and conclusion because she was really good at big-picture stuff. Priya offered to research the critical reception of the chapter, and Austin mumbled something about making slides. That left me with analyzing the actual text, which was perfect. I spent the next week dissecting my own writing, pulling out every deliberate choice I'd made, every callback to earlier scenes, every carefully constructed metaphor. I wrote a 15-page analysis that basically proved Whitmore's entire interpretation was built on misreading the text. When we met again to combine our sections, Kayla read my analysis and frowned. "This is really good, Diana, but it contradicts everything Professor Whitmore has been teaching us. He's going to think we weren't paying attention." She started highlighting sections of my work that disagreed with Whitmore's lectures, suggesting we tone down the criticism and align more with his framework. I watched her red pen cross out my explanations of Eleanor's trauma responses, my careful documentation of how the text actually worked. Priya caught my eye and gave me a sympathetic look but didn't say anything. Austin was on his phone, completely checked out. I took a deep breath and said, "What if Whitmore's framework is wrong? What if there's evidence that the author intended something completely different?" Kayla laughed and closed her laptop. "Diana, no offense, but you're not going to out-analyze a professor who's literally published books on this stuff. We need to give him what he wants if we want a good grade." She wasn't wrong about the grade part, but everything in me rebelled against presenting a false interpretation of my own work just to satisfy Whitmore's ego. That night, I drove to the bookstore where I'd done my first reading for The Drowning Season 4 years ago. The owner, Margaret, had been one of my earliest supporters, and she'd turned her shop into a haven for local authors. I found her in the back office doing inventory, surrounded by stacks of new releases. When I explained what was happening at Riverside, Margaret listened carefully, and then pulled out a worn copy of my book from her desk drawer. "I've sold over 300 copies of this book, Diana. I've heard you read from it, watched you answer questions about Eleanor's journey. That professor doesn't know what he's talking about." She opened to a dog-eared page and showed me margin notes in different colors, annotations from a book club that had discussed it last year. Their interpretations were so much closer to my actual intent than anything Whitmore had said. Margaret offered to write a letter to the university confirming my identity, but I wasn't ready for that nuclear option yet. I needed to try one more time to make Whitmore understand through the work itself, through undeniable textual evidence. Our group presentation was scheduled for the following week. I spent every spare moment refining my section, adding quotes from trauma researchers that aligned with Eleanor's behavior, finding patterns in the text that Whitmore had completely missed. The morning of the presentation, I woke up at 5 a.m. with my heart racing and couldn't get back to sleep. I made coffee and rehearsed my part over and over, trying to sound confident and academic rather than desperate and defensive. My phone buzzed with a text from Beth asking how things were going. I sent back a simple "today's the day" and 3 crossed fingers emojis. She responded with, "Remember, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You wrote a brilliant book regardless of what one professor thinks." But I did need to prove it, at least to myself, that I could defend my own work on its own merits without pulling the "I'm the author" card. I wanted the analysis to stand alone, to be so airtight that Whitmore would have to acknowledge he'd been wrong. The presentation started smoothly enough. Kayla did her introduction with practiced confidence, hitting all the points Whitmore loved about authorial distance and literary tradition. Priya presented the critical reception, carefully choosing reviews that aligned with Whitmore's interpretation, while quietly including a few that didn't. Then it was my turn. I pulled up my slides and started walking through the textual analysis, showing how Eleanor's responses to water matched clinical descriptions of PTSD, how the narrative structure deliberately mimicked the non-linear nature of traumatic memory. I could see Whitmore's expression changing as I presented, his arms crossing tighter, his jaw clenching. When I finished, there was a long pause. Kayla jumped in quickly to transition to Austin's part, but Whitmore held up his hand. "Wait, Diana, are you suggesting that I've been teaching this novel incorrectly for 2 years?" His voice was sharp and the whole class seemed to hold its breath. I met his eyes and said as calmly as I could, "I'm suggesting there's textual evidence for an alternative interpretation that aligns more closely with trauma theory than with concepts of hysteria." Whitmore stood up from his desk and walked to the front of the room, positioning himself directly in front of my group. "This is exactly the problem with contemporary literary criticism. Students think they can cherry-pick quotes and force a reading that suits their political agenda, rather than engaging with what the author actually wrote." He turned to the rest of the class like he was performing for them. "Mitchell's novel is clearly working within a tradition of feminine Gothic literature where women's fears are metaphors for larger societal anxieties. To reduce it to a simple trauma narrative is to miss the entire point of the work." I felt my hands curling into fists at my sides. "But what if the author has explicitly stated that the book is based on her own trauma?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Authors are notoriously unreliable narrators of their own work. Death of the author, Diana. I'm surprised you haven't encountered that concept yet in your studies." He turned back to the class and continued talking like I wasn't even there anymore, dismantling my analysis piece by piece while my group mates stared at their shoes. After class, Priya pulled me aside in the hallway. That took guts. But you know he's going to tank our grade now, right? She wasn't angry, just resigned. Like this was an inevitable consequence of challenging Whitmore's authority. Austin walked past us without making eye contact, clearly annoyed that our presentation had turned into a confrontation. Kayla stopped to say, I warned you, Diana. Now we're all going to suffer for it. She wasn't entirely wrong. 2 days later, our group grade was posted online, C-. The comments said our presentation showed promise but ultimately failed to engage with the text on a sophisticated level, instead relying on reductive psychological readings that missed the literary complexity of Mitchell's work. I stared at that grade on my laptop screen, feeling a mix of anger and vindication. The anger won out. I opened a new document and started typing an email to Professor Whitmore, requesting a meeting during his office hours. If he wanted to discuss sophisticated textual analysis, I'd give him more than he bargained for. Whitmore's office was exactly what you'd expect. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive wooden desk covered in papers, and a window overlooking the campus quad. He gestured for me to sit in the small chair across from his desk, positioning himself in the larger leather chair that made him look like he was presiding over a trial. Diana, I appreciate your passion for the material, but your presentation revealed some fundamental misunderstandings about literary analysis. He pulled out a printed copy of my slides with red ink covering every page. You're confusing biographical criticism with textual analysis. Just because an author experienced trauma doesn't mean every book they write is about that trauma. I let him talk, watching him circle and underline and add sarcastic comments in the margins of my carefully researched work. When he finally paused, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. What if I could show you the author's original notes? Her research materials, character sketches, explicit statements about her intentions? Whitmore leaned back in his chair with a patronizing smile. Diana, even if you had those materials, they wouldn't change the fundamental analysis. The text exists independently of the author's intentions. I opened the folder and spread the documents across his desk. Character sketches for Eleanor with notes about PTSD symptoms. Research papers on trauma and memory that I'd consulted while writing. Excerpts from my own journal about my near-drowning experience that directly paralleled scenes in the book. Whitmore glanced at the papers with vague interest, like I was showing him a student's creative project. These are fascinating fabrications, Diana, but surely you understand that I can't take anonymous documents at face value. Anyone could type up fake author notes. His dismissiveness was so absolute, so unshakable, that I felt something shift inside me. I pulled out my phone and opened my email, scrolling to messages from my publisher, from Beth, from early readers who'd seen the manuscript. I turned the phone toward him, showing him an email chain about Eleanor's character development that was dated 2 years before the book's publication. Whitmore squinted at the screen and then pushed the phone back toward me. Email addresses can be spoofed. I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here, but making up evidence isn't going to change your grade. I stood up from the chair, my legs shaky but my voice steady. I'm not making anything up, Professor Whitmore. I'm Dia Mitchell. I wrote The Drowning Season, and you've been teaching it wrong for 2 years. The words hung in the air between us, and for the first time since I'd entered his office, Whitmore looked uncertain. He glanced at the documents on his desk, then back at my face, then at my phone screen. That's quite a claim. His voice had lost some of its confidence. Dia Mitchell is a pseudonym, obviously, but her real name is... He trailed off, pulling out his phone and presumably Googling me. I watched the realization hit him in stages. First confusion, then recognition, then something that looked almost like panic. His face went pale as he scrolled through images, comparing my face to book jacket photos where I'd worn heavier makeup and styled hair. But you enrolled as Diana Ashford. You never said... He was stammering now, his perfect professor persona crumbling. Why would you hide your identity? This is highly irregular. I gathered my documents from his desk, sliding them back into my folder with deliberate slowness. I enrolled under my legal name because I wanted to study literature without the baggage of being a published author. I wanted honest feedback, genuine discussion. I didn't expect my professor to spend weeks teaching my book as an example of female weakness and hysteria when it's actually about trauma recovery. Whitmore stood up, running his hand through his hair, looking around his office like the walls might offer him some escape. I need to verify this. You understand I can't just take your word for it. I pulled out my driver's license and my author ID card from the National Book Foundation, laying them on his desk. Diana Ashford Mitchell, the name I'd been hiding all semester, right there in black and white. Whitmore picked up the ID card with shaking hands, studying it like it might be a forgery. He compared the photo to my face multiple times, and I could see him mentally reviewing every comment he'd made about my work, every condescending explanation, every dismissal of my undergraduate readings. I didn't know, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. You should have told me. Why? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded when everything inside me was screaming. So you could treat my interpretation as valid only because of who I am, rather than because of the textual evidence? The analysis I presented was solid regardless of my identity. Whitmore sank back into his chair, and I could see him trying to recalibrate, trying to find some way to maintain his authority in this situation. Be that as it may, the principle of death of the author still stands. Your intentions, while interesting, don't override the text itself or how readers and scholars interpret it. I almost laughed at his audacity. Even now, confronted with proof that he'd been wrong, he was doubling down. Professor Whitmore, you didn't just interpret my book differently. You taught it as something it fundamentally isn't. You told students that Eleanor's trauma was hysteria, that her recovery arc was weakness. You used my work to reinforce harmful stereotypes about women and mental health. He flinched at that but didn't back down. That's your subjective reading of my teaching. Literary criticism involves multiple perspectives. I leaned forward, placing both hands on his desk. It's not subjective when you're factually wrong about what happens in the text. Eleanor doesn't give in to hysteria in Chapter 12. She has a panic attack triggered by specific sensory details I carefully planted throughout the earlier chapters. That's not interpretation, that's reading comprehension. Whitmore's face flushed red, anger replacing his earlier shock. I don't appreciate your tone, Ms. Mitchell. Regardless of your identity, you're still a student in my class, and you will show me the respect that position demands. I straightened up, slinging my bag over my shoulder. I'll show you the same respect you showed my work and my analysis. I'm filing a formal complaint with the department chair about your teaching methods and your grading bias. That C- our group received was retaliation for challenging your interpretation, and we both know it. Whitmore stood up abruptly, his chair rolling back and hitting the bookshelf behind him. You're making a serious accusation. Do you have any proof of bias? I pulled out my phone again and opened my recording app. As a matter of fact, I do. I've been recording every class session since week 3. The color drained from Whitmore's face as I played back snippets of his lectures, his voice clearly stating that Mitchell doesn't understand her own protagonist, and that the book exemplifies female weakness. I'd captured every condescending comment, every dismissal of alternative interpretations, every gendered assumption about my work. When I stopped the recording, the office was dead silent except for the ticking of an old clock on his shelf. You can't record classes without permission. There are privacy laws. His voice was desperate now, grasping at straws. I smiled without warmth. Actually, this is a one-party consent state. I'm legally allowed to record any conversation I'm part of. These recordings will be included in my formal complaint, along with documentation of how you graded my group's presentation compared to others. Whitmore sat back down slowly, and I watched him do the math on how bad this could be for him. A published author in his class, recordings of him misrepresenting her work, evidence of retaliatory grading. His academic reputation was about to take a serious hit. What do you want? He asked finally, his professorial authority completely gone. He looked small sitting there, just a man who'd been caught being wrong and doubling down instead of admitting it. I considered the question carefully. I want you to correct your teaching. I want you to apologize to the class for misrepresenting the book. I want our group's grade reviewed by an impartial faculty member. And I want you to understand that death of the author doesn't mean you get to make up whatever interpretation you want and call it scholarship. Whitmore opened his mouth to argue, but I held up my hand to stop him. Or I can take these recordings public. I can write an essay about how one of the country's leading literature professors spent 2 years teaching my National Book Award-winning novel as an example of female hysteria. How do you think that would play in the current academic climate? His jaw clenched, but he nodded slowly. I'll need time to review my materials, to reconsider my interpretation in light of this new information. The grudging way he said it told me he still didn't think he was wrong, just that he'd been caught. I left his office and walked straight to the department chair's suite on the 3rd floor. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo was in her office, eating a salad at her desk while reviewing what looked like budget reports. She looked up when I knocked, her expression shifting to concern when she saw my face. Miss Ashford? Is everything all right? I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. It's actually Mitchell, Diana Ashford Mitchell, and I need to file a formal complaint against Professor Whitmore. I spent the next hour telling her everything, showing her my ID, playing the recordings, explaining how Whitmore had been teaching my book for 2 years with an interpretation that fundamentally misrepresented my work. Dr. Okonkwo listened carefully, taking notes on a legal pad, her expression growing more serious with each new detail. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Why didn't you disclose your identity when you enrolled? This whole situation could have been avoided. I'd been expecting that question, but it still stung. With respect, Dr. Okonkwo, I shouldn't have to announce my credentials to receive fair treatment in a graduate program. My analysis of the text was solid regardless of who I am. The problem isn't that I hid my identity. The problem is that Professor Whitmore dismissed valid textual analysis because it came from a student he didn't respect. Dr. Okonkwo nodded slowly, conceding the point. You're right, of course. But you understand this puts the department in a difficult position. Professor Whitmore is tenured, well-published, and highly regarded in the field. These accusations. She trailed off, and I could see her already calculating the political fallout. I pulled out my phone and played her another recording. This one from the class where Whitmore had mocked a student's interpretation as very undergraduate, and laughed at someone else's suggestion that Eleanor was reclaiming her power. He's not just wrong about my book. He's creating a hostile learning environment for any student who dares to disagree with him. How many other students has he dismissed like this? How many valid interpretations has he shut down because they didn't match his framework? Dr. Okonkwo's expression hardened as she listened. I'll need to keep these recordings for the investigation, and I'll need you to write a formal statement detailing everything that happened, with dates and specific incidents. She pulled out a form and slid it across her desk. I want you to know that I take these allegations seriously. Academic freedom is important, but so is academic integrity. If Professor Whitmore has been misrepresenting source material and retaliating against students who challenge him, that's a serious problem. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. However, I need to warn you that filing this complaint will likely become public knowledge. Your identity as D.A. Mitchell will be revealed to the entire department, possibly to the media if this gets big enough. Are you prepared for that? I thought about it for a long moment, weighing my desire for privacy against my responsibility to other students who might be suffering under Whitmore's teaching. I'm prepared. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about making sure he can't do this to anyone else. That evening, I sat in my apartment drafting the formal complaint, my cat Gatsby purring on my lap while I typed. The document grew to 12 pages as I detailed every incident, every recording, every piece of evidence that Whitmore had been teaching my book in bad faith. My phone kept buzzing with texts from Priya, who'd somehow heard through the department gossip network that something big was going down. Is it true you're D.A. Mitchell? The whole program is freaking out. I sent back a simple yes and turned off my phone, needing silence to finish this. At midnight, I finally submitted the complaint through the university's official portal, attached all my documentation, and sat back feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. There was no taking it back now. I'd lit a match and thrown it into Whitmore's carefully constructed academic reputation. Whatever happened next would change everything. But at least I'd done something. At least I'd stood up for my work and for every student who'd been dismissed and belittled in that classroom. The next morning, my phone exploded with notifications. Someone had leaked the story to the campus newspaper, and by noon it had spread to literary Twitter. National Book Award winner, secretly enrolled in grad program, professor taught her book wrong for 2 years, was trending. Beth called me 7 times before I finally answered, and when I did, she was laughing so hard she could barely speak. Diana, this is insane. This is the best book publicity money can't buy. Do you know how many people are buying the drowning season right now just to see what the fuss is about? I hadn't thought about the publicity angle, had been too focused on the principle of the thing, but Beth was right. My book sales had jumped 30% in a single day. Publishers Weekly wanted an exclusive interview. NPR wanted me on their morning show. Everyone wanted to hear about the author who'd gone undercover and caught a professor teaching her book wrong. The story had everything. Academic drama, gender politics, a David versus Goliath narrative that people couldn't resist. Professor Whitmore sent me an email at 3 a.m. that was clearly written in a panic. Ms. Mitchell, I think we can resolve this situation amicably without involving the media. Perhaps we could discuss revising your grade and issuing a private apology to your group. There's no need for this to become a public spectacle that damages both our reputations. I read it twice, noting how he'd framed it as damage to both our reputations when really this was only hurting him. I forwarded the email to Dr. Okonkwo without responding, letting it serve as more evidence of his attempt to minimize the situation. An hour later, the university released an official statement saying they were investigating the matter and that Professor Whitmore had been placed on administrative leave pending the review. The English department's phone lines were apparently jammed with calls from current students, former students, and journalists all wanting to know more. Several other students came forward with their own stories of Whitmore shutting down their interpretations and retaliating with bad grades. The investigation was growing beyond just my complaint into a larger examination of his teaching methods and grading practices. I gave my first interview to NPR 3 days later, sitting in their local studio with headphones on, while the host asked me about death of the author theory and whether writers should have final say over their work's interpretation. I tried to explain that this wasn't really about author intent versus reader interpretation. It was about a professor teaching factually incorrect information and creating a hostile environment for students. If Professor Whitmore had simply offered a different interpretation, that would be fine. Disagreement is part of literary criticism. But he taught my trauma narrative as hysteria, mocked students who saw the PTDD themes, and graded us down for presenting textual evidence that contradicted his view. That's not interpretation. That's ideological bias masquerading as scholarship. The interview aired during morning drive time and apparently caused heated debates in English departments across the country. Some professors defended Whitmore's right to interpret text however he wanted. Others argued that basic reading comprehension should come before theoretical interpretation. The literary world was divided, and I was at the center of it whether I wanted to be or not. A week into the investigation, Dr. Okonkwo called me into her office again. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and an empty coffee cup forest on her desk. The review committee has finished their preliminary findings. I wanted to tell you personally before it goes public. She handed me a folder thick with documents, interview transcripts from other students, reviews of Whitmore's grading patterns, analysis of his published papers on my work. We found evidence of systematic bias in his teaching and grading. Multiple students reported being penalized for interpretations that differed from his framework. His published papers on your novel contain several factual errors about the text itself, suggesting he was prioritizing his theoretical lens over actual close reading. She paused, looking uncomfortable. He's being formally reprimanded and will be required to undergo training on inclusive teaching practices. His courses will be monitored next semester, but he's not being fired. I felt my stomach drop. That's it? After everything, he just gets a slap on the wrist and has to take a workshop? Dr. Okonkwo sighed heavily. Tenure is a powerful protection, Ms. Mitchell. The university has limited options for discipline short of termination, and the evidence, while concerning, doesn't rise to that level. However, she pulled out another document. Your group's grade has been changed to an A. Professor Whitmore has been required to issue a formal apology to your group and to revise his course materials on your novel, and he's been removed from teaching graduate seminars for the next year. It wasn't enough. Not really. But it was something. More than I'd expected when I first walked into that classroom and heard him call my protagonist hysterical. Dr. Okonkwo leaned forward, her expression sincere. I want you to know that your complaint has already changed our department. We're implementing new policies for student feedback, creating anonymous channels for reporting concerning teaching practices, and reviewing our curriculum to ensure we're teaching diverse perspectives. What you did took courage, and it's making a real difference. I wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired. The semester ended with a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion. I passed all my other classes with solid grades, but the Whitmore situation had overshadowed everything else. Students I'd never spoken to would stop me on campus to share their own stories of bad professors or to debate death of the author theory. Some treated me like a hero, others like I'd betrayed some unwritten academic code by going public. The English department threw a small reception for me, awkwardly acknowledging my presence while trying not to make it seem like they were celebrating the takedown of one of their own faculty members. Whitmore himself was notably absent, still on administrative leave and apparently consulting with lawyers about his options. Beth called with news that a literary magazine wanted to publish an essay version of what happened, offering me $15,000 and a cover feature. I spent a week writing and revising, trying to capture not just the drama, but the larger issues about how we teach literature, how we value interpretation, and who gets taken seriously in academic spaces. The essay published in the spring and sparked another round of national conversation. This time, though, I felt more in control of the narrative. I wasn't just the author who got wronged. I was making an argument about the state of literary education, about the difference between interpretation and misrepresentation, about creating space for students to challenge authority without fear of retaliation. Universities started reaching out, asking me to speak about author intent and teaching methodology. I gave talks at 6 different schools that semester, each time finding myself in front of rooms full of literature students and professors, all debating what had become known as the Mitchell case. Some defended Whitmore, arguing I was trying to control how my work was read. Others saw it as I did. Not about control, but about basic textual accuracy and academic integrity. The conversations were messy and uncomfortable, and exactly what literature departments needed to be having. In April, I received an unexpected email from Professor Whitmore. Dear Ms. Mitchell, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to reach out personally, now that some time has passed and emotions have cooled. I've spent these months reviewing my teaching materials and, I must admit, reevaluating my approach to your novel. While I still maintain that death of the author is a valid critical framework, I can acknowledge that I allowed my theoretical commitments to override careful reading of the text itself. You were correct that Eleanor's trauma is clearly established and developed throughout the narrative. I was wrong to dismiss your analysis, and I was especially wrong to grade your group's presentation as I did. This is not easy for me to admit, as someone who has built a career on confidence in my interpretations. But scholarship requires intellectual honesty, even when that honesty is uncomfortable. The email continued for 3 more paragraphs. Not quite an apology, but closer than I'd expected. He asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee to discuss the book properly, as colleagues rather than as professor and student. I stared at the email for a long time, my cursor hovering over the reply button. I met Whitmore at a cafe off campus on a sunny Saturday morning. He looked different without the armor of his professor persona. Older, more uncertain, wearing a cardigan instead of his usual blazer. We ordered coffee and sat across from each other, the awkwardness thick between us. Thank you for agreeing to meet, he started, stirring sugar into his cup with more focus than necessary. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About my teaching, my assumptions, my ego. He looked up at me then, and I was surprised to see genuine remorse in his expression. I convinced myself that I understood your work better than you did, that my years of studying literature gave me some special insight that transcended your own creative process. That was arrogant and frankly lazy scholarship. I sipped my coffee, waiting to see where this was going. Whitmore continued. I've been rereading The Drowning Season without my theoretical framework, just letting the text speak for itself. You're right about the trauma narrative. It's there in every chapter, carefully constructed and clinically accurate. I missed it because I was looking for something more complicated, more literary, when the truth was right there on the page. We talked for 2 hours, and it was the conversation I'd wanted to have all semester. Whitmore asked questions about my writing process, really listened to my answers, and shared his own evolving thoughts about the book. He admitted that his published papers on my work would need corrections, that he planned to write a follow-up piece acknowledging his misreading. I want to use this as a teaching moment, he said. Not just for my students, but for other scholars. We get so attached to our interpretations that we stop seeing what's actually there. It wasn't a complete redemption arc. He still had work to do repairing his teaching practices and rebuilding trust with students. But it was a start, a genuine attempt to learn from his mistakes rather than just protecting his reputation. When we parted ways, he shook my hand and said, "Your book deserved better than my reading of it. Thank you for holding me accountable, even though I made it incredibly difficult." I walked back to my car feeling something shift. Not quite forgiveness, but maybe understanding. Growth is messy, and rarely happens on our preferred timeline. The university invited me to give a lecture that fall as part of their Distinguished Speakers series. I stood in front of a packed auditorium, looking out at students and faculty and community members who'd come to hear about what happened. I talked about The Drowning Season, about writing Eleanor's journey through trauma and recovery, about the importance of representation and accurate portrayals of mental health in literature. But I also talked about what I'd learned from the experience with Whitmore, about humility, about the difference between interpretation and misrepresentation, about creating educational spaces where disagreement is welcomed, but evidence still matters. Authors don't get to control how readers experience their work, I said, but readers and scholars have a responsibility to engage with what's actually on the page before building their theories. There's a balance between honoring author intent and allowing for multiple interpretations. Finding that balance requires intellectual honesty, careful reading, and willingness to be wrong. The lecture was followed by a Q&A that ran over by 30 minutes, students asking thoughtful questions about writing, teaching, and navigating difficult situations in academic settings. After the lecture, a young woman approached me nervously, clutching a copy of The Drowning Season. "Miss Mitchell, I just wanted to say thank you. I was in Professor Whitmore's class last year, and I disagreed with his interpretation, but I was too scared to speak up. Seeing what you did made me realize I don't have to accept every authority figure's opinion as fact." She asked me to sign her book, and while I wrote my name, she told me she was working on her own novel about surviving anxiety disorder. I was worried that writing about mental health would be seen as weak or melodramatic, but your book showed me it could be powerful and literary. We talked for a few minutes about her project, and I gave her my email in case she wanted feedback on her manuscript. As she walked away, I realized this was why the whole situation had mattered. Not just about correcting one professor's interpretation, but about showing other students, other writers, that their experiences and perspectives were valid and worth defending. 6 months later, I defended my master's thesis on contemporary trauma narratives in American fiction. The defense went smoothly, with a committee who actually engaged with my arguments rather than dismissing them. Professor Whitmore wasn't on my committee. We'd both agreed that would be inappropriate given our history. But he attended the public portion of the defense and asked a thoughtful question about the intersection of personal experience and literary craft. After I passed, he congratulated me in the hallway and told me he'd revised his entire curriculum based on what he'd learned from our confrontation. "I'm teaching your book again next semester," he said. "But this time, I'm leading with the trauma narrative and using it to discuss how we can honor author intent while still exploring multiple interpretations. I'm also bringing in guest speakers who work in trauma psychology to provide context." It was strange hearing him talk about teaching my book correctly after everything, but it was also satisfying, knowing that future students would get a more accurate, more respectful reading of Eleanor's journey. My agent called a week after graduation with news that surprised me. "Diana, your sales have tripled since this all went public. The Drowning season is getting a new printing with a special edition cover, and your publisher wants to know when the next book is coming." I'd been so focused on the academic drama that I'd barely written anything new in months. But sitting down at my desk that evening, looking at a blank document on my screen, I felt words starting to flow for the first time in a long time. This next book would be different, shaped by everything I'd learned about standing up for yourself in your work, about the messy process of creating change, about how sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never expected to fight. I typed the first sentence, then the second, and kept going until I had 5 pages of a new story taking shape. This one would be about a musician who discovers her composition. Professor has been taking credit for her work, blending themes of artistic ownership, gender dynamics in creative fields, and finding your voice when systems try to silence you. The story of what happened with Professor Whitmore still comes up sometimes in interviews and panels. People ask if I regret going public, if I wish I'd handled it differently, if I think I was too harsh or not harsh enough. My answer is always the same. I did what I needed to do to protect my work and other students in that program. Could it have been handled more quietly? Maybe. But quiet conversations behind closed doors don't create systemic change. They don't lead to new policies or revised teaching methods or professors genuinely reconsidering their approaches. Sometimes you have to make noise to make a difference, even when that noise is uncomfortable and messy and risks your own reputation. Looking back now, I'm proud of the scared student who raised her hand in that classroom and challenged a tenured professor. I'm proud of the person who kept pushing even when it would have been easier to drop the class and walk away. And I'm proud of the writer who understood that defending your work isn't about ego, it's about integrity. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like, and subscribe to catch the next one.